The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of rain that doesn't cleanse, it weighs. Cecilia Hartman stood by the window of what used to be her office, now a hollow space filled with unpaid bills, silence, and the faint echo of dreams that once made sense. At 48, she had built a company from scratch, a boutique marketing firm that carried her name and reputation. People once looked at her with admiration, calling her the woman who had it all. But success, she would learn, was often an illusion made of borrowed light. When the economy collapsed, it took her business with it, and her marriage soon followed. She remembered the last morning before everything ended. The phone rang nonstop. Clients canceled contracts. Her husband's voice grew distant with every call. By evening, the house felt like a stranger's. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply packed his clothes, whispered, "I can't do this anymore," and left. That night, Cecilia sat in her kitchen surrounded by silence so thick it felt alive. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, even the wind against the window, everything mocked her stillness. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She had built her identity on stability, and now she was staring into the ruins of both her business and her name. Weeks turned into months, and the reality of bankruptcy became official. The court documents arrived like death certificates, stamped and cold. Cecilia sold her furniture piece by piece, pretending it was temporary. But deep inside, she knew this was a dismantling, not just of her possessions, but of the woman she had been pretending to be. Her friends stopped calling. The few who did spoke to her with pity, hidden behind motivational cliches. She avoided mirrors because she couldn't stand the hollow eyes staring back. Each morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like regret, and stared out the window at the same gray sky. There was no fire left in her, only ashes of the woman who once commanded meetings and decisions. The world had moved on, and she hadn't noticed when she became invisible. She prayed, but her prayers were desperate, filled with fear and accusation. God, where are you? Why me? Haven't I worked hard enough? Haven't I been good enough? The silence that followed felt like abandonment. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, she found a photograph of herself at 32, smiling, radiant, holding a trophy from her first entrepreneurship award. She didn't recognize that woman. "Where did you go?" she whispered. For a long time, she stared at the picture until tears blurred the edges. It wasn't nostalgia. It was mourning. The realization hit her like a cold wind. She hadn't just lost money. She had lost faith. Not faith in God exactly, but in herself, in the unseen connection that once made her believe life was for her, not against her. Her nights were worse. Insomnia became a quiet companion. Thoughts spiraled like storms. The debt, the betrayal, the loneliness. There were moments when she considered escaping it all, disappearing to some small town where no one knew her name. But something inside, faint, fragile, yet unbreakable, refused to die. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity. What if this isn't the end? What if this is a beginning I don't yet understand? She couldn't explain why, but that thought kept her from collapsing completely. On one particularly heavy night, Cecilia drove aimlessly through the city, the streets slick with rain, neon lights bleeding through her windshield. She stopped near the pier, stepped out of the car, and faced the dark ocean. The air smelled of salt and electricity. "I give up," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't do this anymore." The waves roared in response, as if answering back. But in that surrender, something shifted. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the need to fight. She simply stood there, breathing, not planning, not analyzing, not blaming, just being. And in that stillness, she felt the faintest whisper inside her heart. Maybe that's all you ever needed to do. The following days moved slowly. She stopped trying to fix everything at once. Instead, she allowed herself to feel. She cried when she needed to, slept when she could, and wrote in a notebook she hadn't touched in years. Words poured out, not about money or failure, but about meaning. She wrote, "If everything is gone, what's left must be truth." That sentence became her anchor. She didn't understand it fully yet, but it gave her something to hold on to, a quiet thread connecting her pain to a deeper purpose. As weeks passed, she began noticing small details she had ignored before. The way sunlight touched her curtains in the morning, the distant laughter of children in the park, the rhythm of her own breathing. It was as if life was whispering, "I'm still here." She wasn't healed, not even close, but she was listening again. The woman who once measured worth in numbers and schedules was beginning to hear something more delicate, the language of the soul, and though she still didn't know it, that would be the very soil from which her abundance would one day grow. For now, she remained in her small apartment, surrounded by second-hand furniture and unanswered questions. Yet something had changed. The despair had softened. The silence that once terrified her began to feel sacred. She didn't call it faith, not yet, but she started to understand that the breaking wasn't punishment. It was preparation. And so, in the quietest chapter of her life, Cecilia Hartman fell, not into darkness, but into the deep unknown where all true beginnings hide. The city had quieted, or maybe it was just Cecilia's world that had lost its sound. Days no longer carried names, only shades of gray. Monday blended into Sunday, morning into night. The noise of ambition had vanished. There were no emails to answer, no phones ringing, no meetings demanding her best version. What remained was silence, heavy and unfamiliar. At first, she hated it. Silence had a way of amplifying everything she tried to hide: regret, fear, loneliness. But as the weeks stretched into months, the silence began to shape her in ways she didn't yet understand. It stripped her of noise until only truth remained. She woke up each morning before dawn, not because she wanted to, but because sleep had become a stranger. The quiet hours before sunrise were the hardest, when the mind replayed old failures like broken film. She would sit on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint blue light sneaking through the blinds, and think of everything she lost: the company, the marriage, the house, but also the illusion that she was in control. Maybe control was the real lie, she whispered one morning, her voice barely audible. That thought lingered in the air, unsettling, yet oddly liberating. Cecilia began walking through the neighborhood every afternoon. The rhythm of her footsteps against the pavement became her therapy. She noticed things she had ignored for decades: the cracks on the old church wall, the smell of wet earth after the rain, the old man feeding pigeons near the fountain. There was beauty in ordinary things, but she had been too busy to see it before. For years, she had run her life like a machine, chasing outcomes, milestones, validation. Now, there was nothing left to chase, and for the first time, she was simply present. One evening, while passing a bookstore that was going out of business, she stopped in front of the dusty window display. A handwritten sign read, "Everything must go." The irony made her smile faintly. Inside, the place smelled of old paper and fading dreams. Shelves were half empty, the air heavy with nostalgia. She walked through the aisles with no purpose until a thin, worn-out book caught her attention. The title read, "The Power of Your Subconscious Mind." Its cover was cracked, the edges yellowed with time. She remembered hearing that name years ago but had dismissed it as too mystical. Still, something urged her to pick it up. She paid $1 and left, unaware that the small act of buying that forgotten book would quietly redirect the course of her life. That night, she sat by her kitchen table with a single candle burning beside her. The flame flickered gently as she opened the first page. The words spoke of a power sleeping inside every human being, a power shaped by belief, not circumstance. Whatever you impress upon the subconscious mind is expressed in your reality, the author wrote. She read that sentence again and again until it started to feel personal. Had I been impressing fear all along? She wondered. For the first time, she realized that her external collapse might have been a reflection of an inner one. The silence around her no longer felt empty. It felt like a classroom. Over the next days, she began experimenting with new habits. Not the kind she used to measure in productivity charts, but inward rituals. Each morning, before reaching for her phone, she whispered a simple phrase she didn't fully believe yet. "Thank you for the abundance that's already mine." At first, it felt forced, like pretending to be someone she wasn't. But as she repeated the words daily, they started to soften something within her. The old Cecilia would have scoffed at such simplicity. The new Cecilia had nothing left to lose, and therefore, everything to gain. She also began practicing stillness. She would close her eyes and breathe, not to escape her thoughts, but to observe them. She noticed how her mind kept returning to fear, to scarcity, to shame. But rather than resist, she began to ask questions. Why do I believe this? Who told me abundance had to be earned through suffering? The answers didn't come in words. They came as tears. Healing, she realized, was not an achievement. It was an allowance. Days turned into a rhythm of silence, reflection, and small awakenings. One morning, she felt an unusual peace while sipping her coffee. Nothing external had changed. Her bank account was still empty, her apartment still modest. Yet something in her chest felt lighter. She couldn't explain it logically, and for once, she didn't need to. She looked out the window at the soft sunrise and whispered, "Maybe the silence isn't a punishment. Maybe it's where God speaks." That single thought altered everything. From then on, she stopped trying to escape silence and started meeting it like a friend. She turned off the television, muted her phone, and spent evenings journaling her gratitude for the smallest things: a warm meal, a friendly smile, the sound of rain. Each word written in that notebook became a seed of faith, invisible yet alive. Weeks later, she began noticing coincidences. A refund she had forgotten about arriving just when she needed groceries. An unexpected call from a client who wanted to pay an old invoice. They were small, almost trivial, but Cecilia saw them differently. They were signs. Life was responding to her new vibration, even if subtly. She smiled at the realization that nothing outside had changed except her, and that was enough to move everything else. Still, the process wasn't linear. There were days when fear returned like an uninvited guest, whispering reminders of her past failures, but each time, she met it with compassion instead of panic. She began saying to herself, "This is not who I am anymore." It wasn't defiance, it was declaration. Slowly, she was rebuilding her identity not from effort, but from awareness. By the end of that winter, the silence no longer haunted her. It had become sacred ground, the soil of transformation. She no longer sought noise to fill the void, nor validation to prove her worth. Her life was still modest, her path uncertain, but her spirit had begun to heal. The woman who once saw silence as emptiness now understood it as presence, the quiet hum of something divine rearranging her destiny. And as she blew out the candle one night, she whispered, "I don't know where this leads, but I trust it now." For the first time in years, she slept without fear, unaware that faith had already begun its invisible work behind the scenes. The morning light crept slowly across the room, tracing the outlines of Cecilia's few remaining belongings: a chipped mug, a notebook filled with reflections, and a mirror she had tried to avoid for months. It leaned against the wall beside the window, covered halfway with a scarf. There was something unnerving about facing it. It wasn't vanity, it was memory. Every time she looked, she saw fragments of her former life: the woman who smiled in expensive dresses, the woman who believed success defined her worth. Now, when she caught her reflection, she saw someone she barely recognized: eyes tired from worry, hair pulled back without care, shoulders slightly hunched from invisible weight. That morning, something inside urged her not to look away. She stood before the mirror, hesitant, but determined. For the first time in months, she didn't just glance, she looked. And the longer she stared, the harder it was to pretend that her pain was anyone else's fault. She had blamed the economy, her ex-husband, her clients, even God. But beneath every excuse, there was a deeper truth she had been avoiding. She had betrayed herself, not by failing in business, but by ignoring the quiet whispers that had warned her long before the collapse. The mirror didn't accuse her. It revealed her. And the reflection looking back wasn't the villain of her story. It was the survivor. Tears welled up as she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words surprised her. They weren't directed at anyone else. She was apologizing to the woman in the glass, for the years she spent trying to be perfect, for all the moments she silenced her intuition to please others, for the harsh self-talk she had accepted as normal. "You did the best you could," she said softly. The simplicity of that sentence carried a strange power. For months she had been desperate for someone to understand her pain, but now she realized she had been waiting for her own compassion. After that morning, the mirror became part of her ritual. Each day, after brushing her hair, she looked into it and affirmed something different. At first it felt awkward, artificial. "You're still worthy. You're not your mistakes. You're learning." Her voice trembled, sometimes breaking mid-sentence. But repetition has a mysterious way of reshaping belief. Slowly, those sentences stopped sounding like lies and began to feel like promises. Cecilia started reading more from The Power of Your Subconscious Mind, and one passage struck her. "You are not punished for your thoughts. You are punished by them." The line hit her like lightning. She realized that self-blame was not humility. It was self-sabotage disguised as responsibility. For years, she had rehearsed stories of guilt and unworthiness until they became her identity. Every "I'm not enough" had carved deep grooves in her subconscious, repeating like background music she didn't know was playing. The only way to rewrite that melody was to forgive, not others, but herself. Forgiveness, however, didn't come instantly. It was messy and uneven. Some days she felt peaceful, and others she woke up drowning in old anger. Memories resurfaced like waves. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. There were moments she wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. But every time rage rose, she returned to her new practice. Silence, breath, acknowledgement. She would place her hand over her heart and whisper, "This too is healing." It became her way of telling her nervous system that she was safe, even in chaos. As weeks passed, something subtle began to change in her energy. She no longer carried herself like a broken woman. The world hadn't changed. Her bank account was still fragile, her future uncertain, but the heaviness around her began to lift. When she walked to the corner cafe for her morning coffee, strangers smiled at her. The barista once told her, "You have such calm energy." Cecilia almost laughed. Calm was never a word anyone used for her before. But she realized that calm wasn't something she gained. It was something that had always been buried beneath layers of fear. One evening, she stood before the same mirror again, this time lit by golden sunset. Her reflection looked different, not younger, but clearer. She saw a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a gentleness that spoke of quiet strength. For the first time, she understood that the mirror wasn't a judge. It was a teacher. Every line on her face, every scar, every sign of age, they were proof of life lived fully, not evidence of loss. She began journaling her reflections more deeply. One entry read, "I spent years blaming life for not giving me what I wanted. I never realized it was waiting for me to become who could receive it." That sentence became her mantra. Blame and bitterness had kept her trapped in the past, but acceptance was beginning to unlock something new. A sense of trust that perhaps every ending was also an initiation. By spring, the atmosphere around her apartment had shifted. Plants she thought would never bloom began sprouting new leaves. The sunlight through her curtains seemed warmer. Even her breathing felt different. Slower, deeper, anchored. She noticed she no longer dreaded mornings. The silence that once felt punishing now greeted her like an old friend, inviting her to listen. One night, unable to sleep, she walked to the bathroom and stood before the mirror once more. Her reflection met her gaze steadily. "We made it through the worst," she whispered, and for the first time, the voice in her mind didn't argue back. As she turned off the light and returned to bed, she smiled in the dark. The mirror had taught her something sacred. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming herself within it. And though she didn't yet know it, this self-forgiveness was quietly preparing her for the miracles to come. A thin layer of dust covered everything inside the small secondhand bookstore, the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time. The scent of yellowed pages mingled with old wood and rain leaking from the ceiling. Cecilia hadn't planned to enter. She was simply walking home after another long afternoon of searching for freelance work that never called back. Yet something about that dimly lit doorway drew her in, as if the quiet inside carried an invitation meant for her alone. The bell above the door gave a tired chime. Shelves leaned slightly, weighed down by the years, and the floorboards creaked under her shoes. She ran her fingers along the spines of books without reading the titles, each one a memory belonging to someone else. Near the back, half hidden under a stack of travel guides, she noticed a thin, worn-out volume. Its cover was cracked, its letters faded. The Power of Your Subconscious Mind. She hesitated before picking it up. The book felt strangely alive in her hands, as though waiting to be opened again after decades of silence. She turned a few pages. The words seemed simple, almost too simple, yet something in them stirred her. Whatever you impress upon the subconscious mind becomes your reality. The sentence clung to her thoughts like a melody she couldn't forget. She read it again, then again. Each time it sank a little deeper. It wasn't about fate or punishment. It was about participation. Life wasn't happening to her. It was responding through her. She bought the book for less than $1. The cashier, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes, smiled softly and said, "That one has changed many lives." Cecilia only nodded, unsure what to say, but her heart quickened as she stepped back into the drizzle. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and the streets glowed with reflections of amber streetlights. She clutched the book to her chest as though it were fragile glass. Something inside whispered that this wasn't coincidence. It was alignment. That night, she cleared a small space on her kitchen table and lit a single candle. The flame wavered gently, casting long shadows across the walls. She opened the book and began to read aloud. The author spoke of imagination as a sacred instrument, of belief as a blueprint for creation. Cecilia had spent her entire life believing only what she could measure: invoices, deadlines, numbers. Now these pages were suggesting that the unseen held greater influence than anything visible. Her logical mind resisted at first. It called the words naive, unscientific. But deeper down, a quiet curiosity overruled skepticism. She began experimenting. Every morning before getting out of bed, she whispered a single line: "Today, something good is on its way to me." Some days, she meant it. Others, it felt like an empty ritual. Yet she continued, not because she was sure it would work, but because it gave her a reason to rise. Within a week, subtle changes began to surface. Nothing extraordinary, just small alignments that seemed too precise to ignore. The woman downstairs who never spoke to anyone brought her homemade soup. A client she thought had vanished transferred an overdue payment. Even the bus she usually missed arrived right as she reached the stop. Each moment felt like a quiet nod from the universe, confirming, "I'm listening." Cecilia started keeping notes. Not lists of problems, but observations of grace. She wrote about the warmth of sunlight through her curtains, the way laughter returned to her voice when she spoke with her sister, the sense of calm that replaced panic when she took a breath before reacting. It wasn't about luck. It was about frequency. She was beginning to understand that gratitude wasn't a reaction. It was a form of creation. One evening, while rereading a chapter about visualization, she closed her eyes and tried something new. She pictured herself a year ahead, not wealthy, not famous, simply peaceful. In her imagination, she stood in her own apartment, surrounded by light and quiet abundance. She could smell coffee brewing, hear soft jazz playing from an old radio. For a moment, it felt real. When she opened her eyes, tears slipped down her cheeks. She realized she hadn't envisioned a fantasy. She had remembered a truth her soul already knew. Over the following days, Cecilia began approaching life differently. She smiled at strangers. She stopped complaining about prices and started blessing the money she spent. She thanked her old car for still starting each morning. When fear tried to return, she treated it like a passing visitor, acknowledged it, then let it leave. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, like the tide returning after a long storm. One afternoon, she met a young woman sitting on a bench, crying quietly. Without hesitation, Cecilia sat beside her. They spoke for nearly an hour about loss, survival, and starting over. Before leaving, the girl said, "I don't know why, but I feel lighter now." Cecilia smiled faintly. She knew that feeling. It was the invisible exchange that happens when two souls remind each other they're not alone. Back home that night, she placed the old book on her bedside table. The cover was still cracked, but the energy around it felt sacred. She thought about the words she had read: "Change your thoughts, and you change your world." For the first time, she didn't read it as a quote. She received it as instruction. The silence of her apartment no longer echoed with emptiness. It pulsed with quiet possibility. Before turning off the light, Cecilia looked at her reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't the one who had lost everything months ago. Her eyes held something new. Not certainty, but peace. She whispered softly, "Maybe this is how it begins." Not with noise, but with a whisper. As she drifted to sleep, the candle flickered and died out. The room fell into darkness, yet it no longer felt cold. Somewhere deep within, she knew, the same silence that once marked her ending was now the soil of her rebirth. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that feels almost deliberate, as if the world holds its breath waiting for something unseen. Cecilia sat at the small wooden table by her window, the air around her thick with the scent of rain-soaked streets and burnt wax from an old candle she had just lit. Its flame trembled, steady but alive, reflecting on the glass like a tiny sun refusing to surrender to the dark. She hadn't planned to light it. It had been sitting there for months, a leftover from the holiday season she had skipped. Yet tonight, she felt drawn to it, not out of nostalgia, but need. The flicker felt symbolic, a quiet act of defiance against the emptiness that used to drown her evenings. As she watched the light dance, she whispered, "If there's anything left of me, let it start here." Beside the candle lay her Bible. worn and underlined in places she barely remembered marking. She hadn't opened it since the divorce, when prayer had felt like speaking into a void. But tonight, with the flame illuminating the fragile pages, she turned to a random passage. Her eyes landed on a verse she once loved but had long forgotten. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. The words lingered like an answer she didn't know she'd been asking for. She leaned back and exhaled slowly. Be still. That was the opposite of everything she had done her entire life. She had always been moving, building, fixing, chasing. But maybe stillness wasn't weakness. Maybe it was faith. The thought came like a gentle current, carrying her deeper into reflection. For the next hour, she read in silence. The flame wavered, the shadows shifted, and the room seemed to hum with quiet presence. Each verse she stumbled upon felt uncannily personal, as if written specifically for this moment. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." Isaiah 43:2. She closed her eyes and let those words settle inside her chest. It wasn't comfort she felt. It was truth. When the candle burned halfway down, Cecilia began to write. Not goals, not complaints, just confessions. She wrote about the fear that still lingered, the guilt that haunted her, the small miracles she'd noticed since finding the dusty book. The ink flowed without effort, her handwriting shaky but alive. Each sentence felt like a release, a way of telling the universe, "I'm done pretending I have to control it all." Halfway through her writing, she paused. The room was silent except for the soft crackle of wax. Something in that stillness felt holy. Her thoughts grew quiet, her breath deepened, and an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Not physical, but spiritual, like light expanding from the inside out. It wasn't dramatic, yet she knew something irreversible was happening. She whispered without planning to, "If you're here, I'm listening." No voice answered. No miracle occurred. Only peace. A peace that didn't erase her circumstances, but redefined them. The same unpaid bills sat on the counter. The same uncertainty hovered in tomorrow. Yet none of it carried the same weight. The burden hadn't vanished. It had been shared. She understood now why people called faith a mystery. It wasn't a bargain. It was surrender. As midnight approached, Cecilia walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and the city glowed faintly under the streetlights. Somewhere, a church bell rang 12 slow notes. She closed her eyes and remembered another verse she'd once heard in a sermon. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Psalm 35. She whispered the words aloud, not as hope, but as prophecy. She stayed there for a long while, watching the reflection of the candle on the glass. The flame swayed gently with the draft, but it refused to go out. In that trembling light, she saw herself, fragile yet unbroken, uncertain yet luminous. A quiet smile touched her lips. For the first time in years, she felt gratitude, not for what she had, but for what she could still feel. When she finally blew out the candle, the darkness didn't frighten her. It felt different now, not empty, but full of presence. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the cool night breeze. As she climbed into bed, she realized that she no longer feared silence. The silence had become her prayer. Sleep came easily that night, wrapped in stillness and trust. The candle sat cold on the table, but its light remained inside her, flickering quietly, a promise that even the smallest spark, once lit with faith, could rebuild an entire life. The mornings had changed. They no longer arrived like intrusions, but as quiet invitations. Cecilia woke early now, before the first trace of light, when the world was still suspended between night and day. In that hush, she brewed her coffee and sat at the same wooden table where the candle had burned nights before. She had come to love that faint smell of wax and ash. It reminded her that even endings could leave warmth behind. Her notebook lay open beside the old book and the Bible, each page covered with words that had become her private dialogue with the unseen. The ritual was simple: stillness, breath, reflection. It was here, in these early hours, that she began to understand her mind, not as an enemy, but as sacred ground. What she once called failure had become research. Every thought was an ingredient, every emotion a signal. This was her new work, the quiet science of transformation. She had once believed faith and science belonged to opposite worlds. But the deeper she read, the more she saw they spoke the same language. One in metaphor, the other in mechanism. Joe Dispenza's ideas about neuroplasticity echoed verses she had known all along. She thought of the line she'd read that morning. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. It no longer felt like a command. It sounded like instruction. Precise divine biology. Cecilia began to notice the experiments of her own thoughts. When she woke anxious, the day unfolded heavy. When she woke grateful, small wonders seemed to multiply. A stranger holding the elevator, sunlight landing perfectly on her hands, an unexpected check arriving by mail. She didn't call it coincidence anymore. The laboratory was working, not outside but within. To strengthen her focus, she practiced a new discipline. Every time fear whispered its familiar stories, she paused and asked herself, what if the opposite is also true? The question disarmed the mind's old defenses. It was as if a door she never knew existed began opening slowly. Behind it waited peace, quiet, stable, unwavering. Her old self, the woman of plans and panic, still visited sometimes. Doubt returned like a polite ghost, reminding her of overdue bills and lost chances. But instead of reacting, she observed. There you are, she would think gently. But you don't decide anymore. It wasn't arrogance. It was awareness. She was beginning to understand that emotions weren't enemies. They were messages asking to be seen. One afternoon, while cleaning the apartment, she found a dusty mirror leaning behind a pile of boxes. For a moment, she hesitated. The mirror had always been a battleground. But this time, she faced it differently. She looked straight into her reflection and whispered, "You're not broken. You're in process." The words surprised her. They didn't feel rehearsed. They felt discovered. And in that instant, her eyes softened. Not because she believed she was perfect, but because she finally believed she was in progress. The next morning, she added something new to her routine. Before journaling, she closed her eyes and imagined light spreading through her body. Slow, deliberate, cleansing. It wasn't visualization for gain. It was communion. The Bible verse returned to her mind like a whisper carried by memory. The lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. Matthew 6:22. She understood it now. Clarity of perception was illumination. As weeks passed, Cecilia's surroundings began to change in ways subtle but undeniable. Her posture straightened. Her laughter returned, effortless and low. Even the plants on her windowsill, neglected for months, began to bloom again. She noticed the synchronicities stacking like stepping stones. A client offering a small but steady contract, a letter of apology from her ex-husband she never expected, and the sudden urge to forgive, not because he deserved it, but because she did. Still, the transformation wasn't without resistance. Some nights, fatigue struck like a storm, and the old voice returned, the one that whispered, "Who do you think you are to rebuild?" But she had learned how to respond. She would place her hand over her heart and breathe deeply until her pulse slowed. Then she'd whisper, "I am the work of his hands, and his work is never abandoned." It wasn't a mantra. It was remembrance. On one of those sleepless nights, she stood at her window again. The city glimmered in gold and silver lights, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The quiet hum of traffic below sounded like distant waves. She thought about how much had changed. Not the circumstances, but her response to them. The external world had always been a mirror of her internal weather, and she was finally learning to set her own climate. The candle from before still sat on her table, its wick short, its wax hardened. She picked it up, feeling the smooth surface between her palms. She thought of lighting it again, but decided against it. She didn't need fire to remind her of light anymore. It was already alive inside her. Before going to bed, she opened her Bible one last time. Her eyes fell on a verse she had underlined long ago, back when she was still chasing certainty. "The kingdom of God is within you." Luke 17:21. She smiled faintly. The laboratory wasn't in heaven, nor in circumstance. It was here, in the quiet alchemy of her renewed mind. She closed the book gently, placed it beside her bed, and turned off the light. The darkness didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like incubation. Somewhere inside her, new life was forming. Not a version of who she was, but a consciousness she had never dared to imagine. And as sleep finally pulled her under, Cecilia understood what the silence had been teaching all along. Transformation doesn't begin when the world changes. It begins when you finally stop running from the sacred laboratory within. It happened so gradually that Cecilia almost didn't notice. One morning, while walking to the cafe down the street, she caught herself smiling, not for any reason she could name, but because the air felt alive again. The same streets she once dragged her feet through now seemed different. The bakery's scent of fresh bread, the morning light pooling on wet pavement, the soft chatter of strangers. Nothing in the world had changed, yet everything looked new. It wasn't the city that had transformed. It was her perception. That day, she sat by the window of the cafe with her notebook open, and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed like hope. The woman who used to rush through mornings now lingered. She had become an observer, attentive, grateful, unhurried. It struck her that the shift she had prayed for didn't arrive as thunder. It came as quiet awareness. The same life, the same place, but lived from a different center. For months she had trained herself to speak differently. Not out of denial, but declaration. When fear whispered, "You've lost everything," she replied, "I'm being rebuilt." When doubt said, "You're alone," she answered, "I'm being prepared." These weren't affirmations meant to convince. They were acknowledgments of a truth forming beneath the surface. She began to understand the verse she had once skimmed over in church. "Let the weak say, I am strong." Joel 3:10. It wasn't about pretending. It was about participating in a higher reality. Later that afternoon, Cecilia met her neighbor, a retired teacher named Grace, who had lived in the building for years. They'd exchanged polite greetings before, but this time the conversation lingered. Grace spoke about tending her small rooftop garden, and how it reminded her that patience grows the unseen. Cecilia laughed softly. "Maybe that's what I've been learning too," she said. The two women shared tea in silence, and for the first time in a long while, Cecilia felt connected again, not just to someone else, but to life itself. Her evenings also changed. Instead of scrolling through social media or worrying over bills, she developed a ritual she called the reset. She would turn off all lights except for one lamp, sit cross-legged on the floor, and breathe slowly until her thoughts softened. Then she whispered verses that resonated with her newfound faith, letting them fill the space like soft music. Her favorite was one she'd written on a note and taped to the wall. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." Isaiah 43:1. Every time she said it aloud, something deep within her steadied. Around that same period, synchronicities began to appear with increasing frequency. She would think of someone and receive a message from them hours later. A job posting she had considered applying for weeks earlier reappeared in her inbox with extended deadlines. Even small things, like finding exact change in her coat pocket when she needed it, felt like signs. Once, while walking home under a violet sky, she found a single feather on the ground, pure white, untouched by dirt. She smiled, taking it as a quiet reminder that divine timing doesn't need permission to arrive. The transformation also touched her work. A past client called unexpectedly, offering a modest project. It wasn't glamorous, but it reignited something in her, the satisfaction of creating, of contributing. As she typed late into the night, the rhythm of her work felt different. It wasn't driven by fear of scarcity, but by joy in expression. When she sent the finished project, the client replied almost instantly, praising her insight and asking for more collaboration. It was the first professional affirmation she'd received in years, but it landed softly, not as validation, but confirmation that the inner shift was rippling outward. One evening, while journaling, she paused mid-sentence and looked out the window. The city lights blurred into golden threads through the glass. For a brief moment, she felt something vast, a quiet unity between her breath and everything around her. The hum of distant traffic, the glow of apartments, the rustle of wind, all of it pulsed with the same rhythm she felt inside. "So this is what they mean by being in alignment," she murmured. It wasn't magic. It was belonging. Still, she remained humble about her progress. Some mornings she woke up heavy, the echo of old fear trying to return. But now she met it like an old acquaintance, saying silently, "You taught me well, but I don't live there anymore." She didn't try to erase her past. She let it remind her how far she'd come. Growth wasn't linear. It spiraled, looping between clarity and confusion, faith and doubt. But beneath it all ran a constant current of peace, something unshakable. Cecilia noticed that when she spoke to others, her tone had softened. The sharp edges of defensiveness were gone. She listened more, judged less. Even her reflection in the mirror seemed gentler. Lines of exhaustion now looked like evidence of endurance. She remembered a verse she had read the week before. "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles." Isaiah 40:31. The line echoed in her heart as she brushed her hair, and she smiled at her reflection. "I'm not waiting anymore," she whispered. "I'm becoming." That night, as she prepared for bed, she paused by the window one last time. The sky was clear, scattered with stars. A soft breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's balcony. Cecilia closed her eyes and offered no words, only awareness. The woman who once fought every silence now lived inside it. She had become what she once prayed for, proof that peace is not a destination, but a state of being. And somewhere in that still night, beneath the hum of the city and the rhythm of her breath, a divine truth unfolded within her. The greatest miracles never arrive from outside. They awaken quietly within the heart that finally decides to listen. The morning sun rose softly over the city, painting Cecilia's apartment in tones of amber and gold. The light moved slowly across the walls, touching her desk, her books, her half-finished cup of tea. Everything seemed gentler now, as if life had decided to exhale. Cecilia sat quietly, eyes closed, feeling the rhythm of her breath. It was her daily ceremony of stillness, her meeting point with the unseen. She had stopped begging for change. Now she was learning to become it. Weeks earlier, she had read something from Joseph Murphy that struck her like revelation. You are not what you think you are, but what you think you are. She had underlined the sentence 3 times. Every morning since, she had repeated it softly, letting its simplicity reorder her understanding of creation. It wasn't about asking, it was about embodying. Faith, she was discovering, was not passive belief. It was participation in divine law. Her readings had deepened. Bob Proctor called it vibration. Joe Dispenza spoke of coherence. The Bible described it as, according to your faith, be it unto you. Matthew 9:29. Different words for the same mystery, that reality bends not to effort, but to identity. She smiled at the thought. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing outcomes. She was aligning with essence. Cecilia began experimenting with this idea in the smallest ways. When she walked to the market, she carried herself as though her abundance were already established. When she paid her bills, she did so with gratitude, whispering, "Thank you for more than enough." It wasn't performance, it was practice, training her subconscious to recognize a higher order. And the more she lived that frequency, the more synchronicities multiplied around her. One afternoon, she sat at a cafe with her notebook, writing an entry titled, Becoming. The pen moved almost by itself. She wrote, "Creation doesn't answer to waiting. It answers to identity. The day I stopped being the woman who lost everything and started being the one who found purpose, life rearranged itself around that truth." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing the magnitude of her own words. It wasn't arrogance. It was awareness. The external world had never been against her. It had only mirrored her internal broadcast. She remembered reading in Dispenza's work that the brain cannot distinguish between imagination and experience, that what the mind rehearses emotionally, the body believes chemically. Cecilia closed her eyes, recalling the verse from Proverbs. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. The science and the scripture were saying the same thing. Faith wasn't wishful thinking. It was spiritual neuroplasticity, rewiring the self until alignment becomes inevitable. Later that evening, she sat by the window, candle flickering beside her. The flame danced in rhythm with her breath. She whispered a prayer, not asking for provision, but giving thanks for fulfillment already received. "Thank you for the peace that's visible even in the unseen," she said softly. The words felt weightless, yet powerful. Her old self would have called it foolishness. Now she recognized it as the language of creation. Outside, the world was settling into dusk. A light rain began to fall, the sound gentle, rhythmic. Cecilia thought of the words she'd once written. If everything is gone, what's left must be truth. Tonight, that truth had matured. She realized that loss had been her initiation, the dismantling of false identities so her true one could emerge. "You are not being punished," she whispered to herself. "You are being positioned." As she journaled, her phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague she hadn't spoken to in years. He was starting a new project and remembered her creative spark. Would she consider helping? The offer wasn't grand, but something in her heart leapt, not for the opportunity itself, but for the timing. The moment mirrored a promise. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew 6:33. She smiled, knowing this wasn't random. The inner frequency had shifted, and the outer world was simply responding. That night, sleep came easily. Her dreams were vivid. She stood barefoot in a vast field of golden grass, the wind carrying whispers of languages she didn't understand yet somehow knew. In the distance she saw herself, radiant, calm, walking toward her. When they met, no words were exchanged. The two versions of her simply merged. When she woke, her heart was racing, but not from fear, from recognition. The dream wasn't fantasy, it was instruction. She was witnessing her own becoming. The following morning, Cecilia returned to her table, lit a new candle, and opened her notebook. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "The law of becoming is not about effort. It's about embodiment. When I feel as though I already am, the universe must agree. God doesn't meet me halfway. He meets me where I already believe." She paused and looked out the window, where sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering brilliance across the wet streets. "This," she thought, "is what grace looks like in motion." She whispered a verse she'd come to love. "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Hebrews 11:1. Cecilia smiled, her eyes wet with quiet gratitude. The woman who once pleaded for signs was now living among them. Her frequency had changed, and the world, faithful mirror that it was, could only reflect her new state. As the candle flame steadied beside her, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the gentle hum of life within and around her. She didn't need to see evidence anymore. She was the evidence. The laboratory had become light. The morning began in stillness, the kind that feels deliberate, as though the universe pauses to listen. Cecilia sat by her window, wrapped in a light shawl, watching the sun spill over the rooftops. The city below was slowly awakening, the hum of distant traffic, the whistle of a kettle from a neighboring apartment, the muted rhythm of footsteps on the wet pavement. Life carried on, unaware that within this small room, something extraordinary was taking shape. Confidence had returned, not the kind she once performed in boardrooms or behind forced smiles, but a quieter, truer version. It wasn't about being certain, it was about being centered. She no longer sought validation from circumstances. Her peace came from within, a frequency that couldn't be negotiated. She remembered a passage from Joe Dispenza. "When you feel the emotion of your future before it happens, you are signaling the body into a new destiny." Cecilia smiled softly. That's what this feeling was. The emotional proof of a reality already forming. She rose, brewed coffee, and opened her Bible, letting it fall naturally to a page she hadn't read in years. Her eyes landed on Isaiah 60:1. "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." The words filled her chest like breath itself. She whispered them aloud, feeling their vibration ripple through the room. For the first time, she understood that glory wasn't about spotlight or recognition. It was about resonance, the alignment between the divine and the human. Later that afternoon, Cecilia decided to visit the park she used to avoid. For months after her bankruptcy, she couldn't stand the sight of families, joggers, and laughter. It had all felt like a foreign language. But today, she walked with ease. The trees were shedding their last leaves, golden and brittle, and each step she took crunched softly beneath her boots. The air smelled of earth and transition. Children ran across the grass, and somewhere nearby, an old man played a melody on a worn guitar. It was imperfect, yet beautiful. As she sat on a bench, the sunlight filtered through the branches and landed on her hands. She studied them quietly, the same hands that had once built and lost so much. They trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from aliveness. "You're still here," she murmured to herself. "After everything, you're still here." The statement wasn't self-pity. It was worship. She felt tears gather, not from sadness, but reverence. The verse from Corinthians echoed in her heart. "When I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12-10. That evening, back in her apartment, she revisited her journal. Each page told a story of evolution, from despair to curiosity, from curiosity to faith, from faith to knowing. She read her own handwriting and marveled at the progression. There were no miracles written in ink, yet every line was proof of one. She realized the divine didn't always arrive with lightning. Sometimes it came as subtle awareness that you had already crossed the threshold you once feared. Cecilia remembered a lesson from Joseph Murphy. Confidence is born when you convince the subconscious mind that God's power is within you. That line had once sounded abstract. Now it was embodied. Her confidence no longer shouted. It glowed. It wasn't the armor she wore to face the world. It was the light that rose quietly from her soul. Days passed, and Cecilia noticed new opportunities appearing almost rhythmically. A woman she met at the cafe introduced her to a local community center, seeking volunteers for a creative mentorship program. Cecilia hesitated at first. The old fear of inadequacy flickered, but then she felt a gentle nudge within. "Why not?" she whispered. It was a small beginning, but something in her spirit knew that purpose grows in service. Her first day at the center was humbling. She worked with women rebuilding their lives after divorce, grief, or unemployment. Listening to their stories, Cecilia recognized fragments of her own pain mirrored in theirs. Yet, as she spoke, not preaching, but sharing, she noticed their eyes soften, their shoulders relax. Her story wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to heal. One of the women took her hand and said, "You speak like someone who's been to the bottom and found God there." Cecilia smiled, feeling her throat tighten. "That's exactly where I met him," she replied. That night, walking home under the amber glow of streetlights, she felt something shift again, a widening inside her. It wasn't pride. It was gratitude. She understood now that confidence wasn't about control, but trust. It was the calm certainty that she and the Creator were co-authors of the same unfolding story. She whispered softly, "I walk by faith, not by sight." 2 Corinthians 5:7. Back home, she stood before her mirror, the one that had once reflected despair. Tonight, the woman staring back carried an entirely different energy. Her eyes were steady, her shoulders strong. There were lines around her mouth that spoke of laughter and survival. "Welcome back," she said quietly to her reflection. The words carried weight, not because she needed them, but because they were true. Before bed, she wrote one last line in her journal. "Confidence is not the return of who I was. It's the birth of who I was meant to be." She closed the notebook and turned off the light. The darkness no longer represented endings. It was soil, nurturing new roots. And as she drifted into sleep, a verse from Psalms whispered through her mind like a lullaby. "The Lord will perfect that which concerns me." Psalm 138:8. Cecilia smiled in the dark, knowing the work was far from finished. But the fear was gone. The woman who once doubted her place in the world was gone too. In her place stood someone reborn, not through achievement, but through remembrance. And for the first time in years, her last waking thought was not worry, but peace. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, quiet, almost invisible, like most miracles do. Cecilia was sorting through emails at her small desk, sunlight spilling across the papers in soft patterns, when she saw the name. Daniel Rowe. It had been years since she last heard from him. A former colleague from her marketing days, one of the few who treated her with genuine kindness even after the bankruptcy. The subject line read simply, "A small idea." She clicked it without expectation. Inside, the message was short, almost hesitant. "Cecilia, I've started a small media project and thought of you immediately. It's not much yet, but something about your perspective could help shape it. Are you open to a conversation?" She stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling her heartbeat slow. It wasn't the opportunity itself that moved her. It was the timing. Just last night, she had written in her journal, "God, I don't need a breakthrough. I just need a direction." And here it was, quiet as a whisper, arriving without noise or struggle. She smiled, remembering a verse she'd underlined weeks earlier. "Before they call, I will answer. And while they are still speaking, I will hear." Isaiah 65:24. It wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation, the natural rhythm of divine alignment she had come to recognize. Cecilia took a deep breath and replied with calm clarity, "Yes, I'd be honored to talk. Let's meet." The next afternoon, they met at a cafe by the river, the same place she used to sit when searching for hope months ago, though now it felt completely different. Daniel greeted her with a warm smile, and the same easy energy she remembered. He explained the project, a small online magazine that featured personal essays on resilience and creativity. "It's still growing," he said, "but I need someone who can capture emotion, real stories that touch people." He paused, searching her expression. "You've lived it, Cecilia. You don't just write words, you understand them." She listened quietly, heart steady. The old Cecilia would have questioned her worth, worried about her skills being outdated. But now there was no fear, only peace. She recalled something Bob Proctor once said in an old seminar. "When your vibration matches your desire, the way will always appear." often disguised as chance. And here it was, disguised as a casual meeting over coffee. They agreed she would start small, one article a week, a simple reflection column called The Art of Starting Over. The title made her smile. It mirrored her own life too perfectly to be random. That night, Cecilia returned home under a sky brushed with violet and gold. She walked slowly, breathing in the cool air, her senses sharp and awake. Every sound, distant laughter, rustling leaves, the hum of city lights, felt like a hymn of gratitude. She didn't rush to celebrate or call anyone. Instead, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. You make all things new. Revelation 21:5. The following morning, she sat before her laptop to write her first piece. For a moment she hesitated, not from fear but reverence. Writing no longer felt like work. It felt like communion. She remembered Joseph Murphy's teaching. Your words are seeds. Whatever you plant in consciousness, you shall reap in experience. She closed her eyes and whispered, let this writing be a blessing. Then she began to type. The story that flowed out wasn't about her downfall or success. It was about the sacred pause between both. She wrote about the silence that rebuilds, the nights when surrender becomes prayer, the way grace arrives without permission. Her words felt guided, not written by her, but through her. When she finished, she leaned back, tears gathering in her eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was awe. A week later, Daniel called. Cecilia, he said, his voice bright with emotion. Your piece went viral. We've received dozens of messages from readers saying it gave them hope. You've struck something deep. He paused, then laughed softly. I knew this would happen. Cecilia's breath caught. Viral. Hope. These were words she hadn't heard attached to her name in years. Yet her reaction wasn't pride. It was stillness. This is what alignment feels like, she thought. She remembered the line from Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to them that love God. The verse wasn't abstract anymore. It was lived experience. As days turned into weeks, her column gained traction. Each story she wrote came from the quiet intersection of faith and memory. She no longer wrote for approval. She wrote from overflow. Her once fractured voice had become a vessel for healing. But more than success, what astonished her was the ease. She used to equate progress with exhaustion, achievement with struggle. Now, things unfolded with grace. That's the law of allowance, she remembered reading from Dispenza. When you stop resisting, creation rushes to meet you. One evening, after finishing her third article, Cecilia stood by the window, looking at the city lights flicker like distant candles. She whispered, it's not about doors opening. It's about realizing I was never locked out. The next day, she received a message from a woman named Elise, one of her readers. Your words saved me from giving up. I saw myself in your story. Thank you for reminding me that stillness is not failure. Cecilia read it twice, her throat tightening. That single message carried more value than any paycheck. As she placed her phone down, she whispered a verse she had memorized long ago, but never truly understood until now. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Matthew 5:16. The opportunity had indeed knocked softly, but it had opened a door far larger than she'd imagined. Through it, she wasn't just rebuilding a career, she was rediscovering her calling. And somewhere deep within her spirit, she heard the faint echo of truth. You were never waiting for life to begin again. Life was waiting for you to remember who you are. The rhythm of Cecilia's life had changed. Mornings now felt sacred, not busy, not rushed, but filled with quiet anticipation. Each sunrise carried a whisper of possibility, and each word she wrote seemed to ripple beyond the screen, touching unseen hearts. Her column, The Art of Starting Over, had grown beyond her expectations. Emails poured in daily, women sharing their stories of loss, renewal, and faith rediscovered. What once felt like her greatest wound was now a bridge, connecting lives through honesty and grace. Still, Cecilia remained grounded. She brewed her coffee, opened her Bible, and whispered gratitude before every article. On this particular morning, her eyes fell on a verse she had underlined years earlier, but never understood until now. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Proverbs 16:3. She smiled softly. Her work was no longer survival. It was service. Later that week, Daniel invited her to a meeting at the small office space he had rented downtown. The building was old, but the energy inside was alive with ideas. When Cecilia arrived, Daniel introduced her to a handful of young writers and editors. They spoke passionately about expanding the magazine, creating online workshops, and developing a podcast centered on transformation and storytelling. Daniel turned to her. "We want you to lead this next phase, Cecilia. You've become the heart of this project." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The offer was unexpected, but something inside her, a deep, grounded knowing, recognized it as alignment. Joseph Murphy's words echoed in her mind. When you move with faith, the subconscious organizes every detail to match your conviction. She didn't need to overthink it. The answer was already written in her spirit. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's build it." The weeks that followed were a blur of inspiration. Cecilia created editorial plans, designed courses on healing through writing, and mentored others in storytelling as therapy. The once broken woman now stood as a vessel of restoration. Every project she touched seemed to expand effortlessly. She remembered what Bob Proctor had said in an old interview. "When you're in harmony with your purpose, you don't chase opportunities. They orbit around you." It was true. Ideas, people, and resources flowed toward her without strain. What she once tried to achieve through ambition now unfolded through alignment. One afternoon, as she reviewed a set of essays from contributors around the world, she paused to breathe in the moment. The hum of conversation from the next room, the smell of ink and coffee, the soft laughter between colleagues, it all felt divinely orchestrated. She whispered under her breath, "This is what co-creation feels like." But even in that flow, Cecilia remained humble. She knew that success was never the goal. It was a consequence of service. Purpose, she often said to herself, isn't found in grand gestures. It hides in everyday faithfulness. That understanding became the cornerstone of her teaching. During a team meeting, one of the interns asked how she stayed so calm when challenges arose. Cecilia smiled. "Because I stopped trying to control outcomes," she said. "Control is fear pretending to be wisdom. Faith is peace pretending to be impossible." The room went silent, not from awe, but recognition. Outside of work, her personal life began to reflect the same serenity. She noticed how her energy affected everything around her. Conversations, relationships, even the air she walked through. Dispenza's research came to mind. When your heart and mind align, your electromagnetic field expands to influence everything within its range. She didn't need to understand the physics of it. She could feel it. Her presence carried a frequency of calm, and people responded to it instinctively. One evening, as she left the office, Daniel caught up to her. "You've changed this place," he said sincerely. "You've changed me." Cecilia laughed gently. "No," she replied. "We've simply remembered what matters." He smiled, nodding. "Then maybe that's the real business we're in. Remembering." That night, Cecilia sat at her kitchen table, reflecting on how far she had come. The woman who once measured worth by income now measured it by impact. She opened her journal and wrote, "Purpose doesn't chase profit. Profit follows purpose." Then she added, "To serve is to prosper." The simplicity of those sentences felt like truth carved into her soul. As she finished writing, a breeze swept through the open window, flickering the candle beside her. She closed her eyes and whispered a verse that had become her anchor. "The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought." Isaiah 58:11. She could feel it, that divine companionship, invisible yet unmistakable. Cecilia thought of all the times she had begged for signs, unaware that the sign was always her own growth. Every closed door had redirected her to the one within. Every loss had been a clearing for something eternal to bloom. "God never withheld," she said softly. "He was waiting until I became who could receive." The clock ticked quietly, marking the passage of another evening filled not with noise, but purpose. She didn't know what the next season would bring, but for the first time, uncertainty didn't frighten her. It inspired her. She was no longer the woman trying to rebuild a life. She was the woman living one. As she blew out the candle, the faint smoke curled upward like a prayer made visible. The scent lingered in the air, mingling with the whisper of night. In that moment, Cecilia felt an overwhelming peace, not because she had arrived, but because she had surrendered the need to. And somewhere deep within her heart, a new realization settled like dawn breaking over water. Purpose had never been something she found. It was something she became. Gratitude had become Cecilia's first language. She no longer reserved it for the extraordinary. It lived in her smallest gestures, the warmth of her morning cup, the soft hum of the city before dawn, the sound of her pen gliding across paper. Every breath felt like an answered prayer. What once seemed like ordinary moments now shimmered with quiet holiness. Gratitude, she realized, wasn't a reaction to blessing. It was the magnet that drew it near. She often remembered something Joe Dispenza had written. When you feel gratitude ahead of time, you are broadcasting the frequency of your future. Cecilia smiled each time that line crossed her mind. It was more than science. It was scripture in disguise. She thought of 1 Thessalonians 5:18. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God concerning you. Gratitude, whether in science or faith, was the same law, an act of alignment with divine rhythm. Every morning, before opening her laptop, she placed her hands over her heart and whispered, "Thank you for what I can't see yet." It was a ritual of trust, a declaration that the unseen was as real as the visible. This new habit transformed not only her emotions but her outcomes. The more she practiced thankfulness, the more synchronicities wove through her days, small, perfect alignments that made her smile in awe. One day, she woke to find an email from a global publishing house requesting permission to feature her column in a printed anthology about resilience. Another morning, she opened her mailbox to a handwritten note from a reader in Brazil who said, "Your words reached me like prayer. I keep them beside my Bible." These moments didn't inflate her pride. They expanded her reverence. She whispered softly, "All glory to the one who multiplies what we surrender." Gratitude began to change her physiology. She moved differently, slower, softer, as if walking through sacred air. Even her laughter had a new tone, fuller and freer. She could feel Joseph Murphy's teachings pulsing through her life. The thankful heart is always close to the creative forces of the universe. It was true. Gratitude was not emotion. It was creation. Every "thank you" she spoke carved space for more light. One evening, while watching the sunset from her balcony, Cecilia found herself reflecting on the paradox of gratitude. It's easy to thank God when everything shines, she thought, but the true alchemy happens when we give thanks in the dark. She remembered the verse from Habakkuk 3:17-18. Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Faith is thanking before receiving. Love is thanking even when losing." The more she lived this truth, the clearer her perception became. She noticed how gratitude altered her vibration, how it lifted the heaviness of worry before it could take root. Bob Proctor's words echoed in her mind. When you're grateful, you're in harmony with good. It wasn't philosophy. It was physics of the soul. Gratitude tuned her to abundance like a radio dial, aligning with a divine frequency. Her co-workers began to notice too. "You have this calm about you," one of the interns said during lunch. "Even when things go wrong, you smile like you already know it'll work out." Cecilia laughed gently. "Maybe I do," she replied. "Not because I'm sure of outcomes, but because I'm sure of who's guiding them." On weekends, she started hosting small writing circles at the community center. Before every session, she invited the women to pause, close their eyes, and name 3 things they were thankful for. Not grand things, but the simple ones. Breath, warmth, the sound of their own heartbeat. Some cried. Others couldn't think of anything at first. But by the end of each session, their faces had changed. Softer, brighter, alive. Cecilia would tell them, gratitude doesn't ignore pain. It transforms it into wisdom. One evening, after one of those gatherings, she walked home under a velvet sky, the moon hanging low and golden. She felt something sacred inside her. Not elation, but peace that hummed steady and deep. This is it, she thought. This is abundance. Not the kind measured in money or success, but the abundance of awareness. The knowing that nothing is missing when your heart is full. Back at home, she sat near the window with her candle lit low. Her Bible lay open to Psalm 104. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. She whispered the words aloud, realizing they described her entire transformation. Gratitude had been her gate, the threshold between scarcity and sufficiency, despair and delight. As the candle burned lower, Cecilia wrote one final reflection in her journal that night. Gratitude is the frequency of heaven disguised as emotion. The moment you feel thankful, you've already touched eternity. She closed the notebook, smiling softly. The room glowed with the faint warmth of candlelight, and outside a soft wind moved through the streets like a benediction. She leaned back, eyes half closed, and whispered into the silence, "Thank you for everything that was, everything that is, and everything that will be." The flame flickered once, then steadied, its golden light reflecting gently in her eyes. And in that still moment, Cecilia understood. She hadn't learned to practice gratitude. She had become it. It came on a Thursday evening, when the sky over the city had turned the color of fading lavender. Cecilia had just finished proofreading an article and was preparing a pot of chamomile tea when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Cecilia?" The voice on the other end was gentle, slightly nervous. "It's Adrian. I don't know if you remember me." She froze. Of course she remembered. Adrian Morales, a former client from years ago, one of the few who had treated her with respect, even when her company was collapsing. They had lost touch after the bankruptcy, their last interaction polite but final. "Adrian," she said softly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Of course I remember," he exhaled, relief in his tone. "I hope I'm not intruding. I've been following your writing, your column. He paused, searching for the right word. "It's real, Cecilia. It carries something that can't be taught." For a moment, silence hung between them, filled with the quiet hum of gratitude. "Thank you," she replied. "That means more than you know." He hesitated again before continuing. "I'm hosting a charity event next weekend for a literacy foundation. I'd love for you to come. Not as press, just as a guest. I think you'd enjoy it." Cecilia felt her pulse quicken. It wasn't just the invitation, it was what it represented. For years, she had avoided events like that, afraid of facing people who once saw her rise and fall. Yet something within her whispered that this time was different. She smiled to herself and said, "Yes, I'd love to." That night, as she sat by her window, the candle flickering beside her, she reflected on the call. The old Cecilia would have worried about what to wear, about being judged, about proving her worth. But the woman she had become no longer chased approval. She remembered a line from Joseph Murphy. "You will rise by the thoughts you choose to accept as true." She whispered to herself, "I am walking into this, not as who I was, but as who I've become." The following week passed quickly. On the night of the event, Cecilia stood before her mirror, adjusting the simple navy dress she had chosen. It wasn't glamorous, but it carried elegance, a quiet confidence. She remembered the verse she had read that morning. "Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs without fear of the future." Proverbs 31:25. She smiled, sensing how literal the words felt now. When she arrived at the venue, a restored library bathed in golden light, she felt no anxiety, only calm curiosity. The room was filled with conversation, laughter, and the soft hum of a live jazz band. Adrian spotted her almost immediately and waved. He looked older, perhaps more thoughtful, but his warmth was unchanged. "I'm so glad you came," he said sincerely. "You have no idea how much your words have helped people, myself included." Cecilia tilted her head, touched. "I had no idea you even read my work." "I do," he said, smiling, "especially the one about the silence that builds you. It found me at the perfect time. I'd just lost my father." His voice faltered briefly. It reminded me that healing doesn't always look like progress. Her eyes softened. "That piece healed me too," she said quietly. "Maybe that's why it reached you." For a moment they stood there, two souls connected by shared fragility. The noise of the room faded behind them, replaced by a stillness that felt sacred. Cecilia realized how profoundly life had changed, not in possessions or status, but in purpose. She was no longer surviving, she was serving. Later that night, as the event ended, Adrian approached her again. "We're launching a mentorship program for young women writers," he said. "I'd like you to lead it. You have something textbooks can't teach. Presence." The word lingered in her mind. Presence. She remembered Bob Proctor's teaching. Success isn't about doing. It's about becoming the vibration of the thing you desire. That was what this was. Not achievement, but embodiment. Cecilia didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes for a moment, sensing the still, familiar voice within, the one that never rushed, never shouted. It whispered gently, "This is the next door." When she opened her eyes, she smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll do it." Driving home that night, the city lights glimmered like constellations scattered across the earth. She turned off the radio and let the silence fill the car. Gratitude rose from her chest like light, soft, pure, uncontainable. "You make all things beautiful in your time," she whispered, recalling Ecclesiastes 3:11. At a red light, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes glowed with something she hadn't seen in years. serenity without effort, joy without reason. For a brief second, she imagined her younger self sitting beside her, the woman who once cried over unpaid bills and broken dreams. Cecilia smiled at that version of herself and said softly, "Thank you for not giving up." When she reached home, she sat by the window as she always did, watching the candlelight sway. The invitation had been unexpected, but she knew better now. Nothing was truly random. Every step had been guided, every delay divine. She opened her Bible to Psalm 37:4 and read aloud, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." It wasn't about asking, it was about aligning. Tonight she understood that more deeply than ever. Cecilia leaned back, eyes half closed, the flicker of the flame reflecting in her pupils. She didn't know where this new chapter would lead, but for the first time, she didn't need to. The invitation had been more than an event. It had been a mirror, a reminder that when you become light, life can't help but invite you to shine. There was a stillness in the air that morning, the kind that comes only after a long journey has settled into peace. The city glowed beneath a pale gold sunrise, and Cecilia stood on her balcony, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Below her, life unfolded as always, people rushing to work, children laughing, the sound of footsteps echoing on wet pavement, yet everything looked new. It wasn't the world that had changed. It was her awareness. This was abundance, not the grand, noisy kind that demands to be seen, but the quiet richness that hums beneath ordinary days. It was in her breath, her health, her laughter, the gentle rhythm of knowing she was enough. She thought of Joseph Murphy's words, "Wealth is a state of consciousness. The rich person is rich because of the awareness of abundance within." Cecilia smiled. For the first time, she fully understood. The mentorship program Adrian had invited her to lead had blossomed beyond expectation. Each week, she gathered with a group of women, some young, some older, who came carrying stories of pain, resilience, and hope. Together they wrote, prayed, and dreamed aloud. It wasn't therapy, it was transformation. Cecilia didn't teach them how to write. She reminded them how to believe again. One afternoon, during a session, a woman named Laura raised her hand and asked, "How do you know when you've finally made it?" The room grew quiet. Cecilia looked around, her gaze soft but firm. "When you stop measuring your life by what's missing," she said, "and start celebrating what's already present." She paused, then added, "You'll know you're abundant when gratitude becomes your default thought." The women nodded, and some smiled through tears. Cecilia's days flowed with grace. She still worked with Daniel on the magazine, now expanding it into podcasts and short films about resilience. Invitations to speak began to arrive from organizations, churches, and conferences, yet she accepted only those that aligned with peace. "If it costs me my calm," she often said, "it's too expensive." Her home had become a sanctuary. The same apartment that once felt like confinement now breathed serenity. Plants thrived in the sunlight. Candles flickered each evening. Her Bible, open on the table, carried pages worn from love. She had created what Joe Dispenza called coherence, the state where heart and mind move as one. It wasn't theory anymore. It was embodiment. One night, after finishing a call with her writing group, she sat quietly by the window. The candle burned low, its flame steady. She whispered a verse she had come to cherish deeply. "My cup runneth over," Psalm 23:5. The words carried weight now, not as metaphor, but memory. Her cup had once been empty. Now it overflowed, not because she had gained more, but because she had learned to notice what was already pouring in. Her abundance wasn't only material, but the outer world reflected her inner transformation. The publishing house renewed her column into a full book deal. Her mentorship program was funded for expansion. Even her health, once fragile under the weight of stress, had renewed itself. Her body felt lighter, her energy constant. Bob Proctor's voice echoed in her mind. "You cannot hold abundance in consciousness and live in limitation. The law will not allow it." Still, Cecilia remained humble. She knew prosperity without purpose becomes emptiness. "Everything I receive," she wrote in her journal, "must flow through me, not just to me." That line became her guiding principle. When she received her first royalty check, she used part of it to fund scholarships for single mothers who wanted to study writing. "If God trusted me with overflow," she said quietly, "then the overflow must serve." On weekends, she volunteered at the community center, mentoring women who reminded her of her past self, weary, afraid, but full of hidden light. She didn't preach. She simply told her story, how losing everything had led her to find what could never be taken again. "You can rebuild," she would say gently, "not because of luck, but because the power that created the stars also lives in you." One evening, after leaving the center, she stopped at a small cafe to rest. The place was nearly empty. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and a song played low in the background. As she sipped her tea, she noticed an elderly man reading a worn Bible by the corner table. Their eyes met briefly, and he smiled. "Beautiful night," he said. "Yes," she replied. "It really is." He nodded thoughtfully, then added, "You carry peace. Few people do." Cecilia blinked, taken aback. "It took a long time to find it," she said. The man chuckled softly. "You didn't find it, child. You remembered it." The word struck her like a bell. She opened her mouth to reply, but he had already turned back to his reading. A few moments later, when she looked again, the chair was empty, as if he had simply vanished. She sat still, the air around her charged with something holy. Whether he had been a stranger, a messenger, or a passing soul, she didn't know. But the truth remained. Peace had always been within. That night, Cecilia returned home and lit her candle. As the flame steadied, she whispered the words that had become her life's anthem. "Give, and it shall be given unto you." Luke 6:38. Her voice trembled, not from doubt but awe. Outside, rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. Inside, her spirit felt as vast as the sky. The woman who once lived in scarcity now walked in overflow, not of possessions, but of presence. And as she closed her eyes, resting her palms over her heart, she realized something profound. Abundance was never a reward for healing. It was the natural language of a soul that had finally come home. Dawn arrived slowly, draping the sky in hues of pearl and gold. The city stirred beneath Cecilia's window, its sounds soft and familiar. She sat at her table, the same wooden one that had witnessed every version of her. The woman who once trembled in fear, the one who learned to listen, the one who rose. Steam rose from her cup of tea, and beside it lay her open Bible, her journal, and the candle that had burned through every season of her rebirth. The flame flickered gently, alive with memory. Cecilia had stopped waiting for miracles. Somewhere along the journey she had realized she had become one. It wasn't dramatic, nor loud. It was quiet, the kind that grows in stillness until it fills every corner of your life without fanfare. She had come to understand what Joseph Murphy meant when he wrote, "Prayer is the soul's silent desire, uttered or unexpressed." She no longer asked, she embodied. Gratitude had replaced pleading. Awareness had replaced striving. Her book was now in print. The mentorship program flourished. Her home, once filled with echoes of worry, now radiated warmth. Yet, what filled her heart most wasn't the success. It was the serenity that no external condition could touch. She recalled a passage from Joe Dispenza. "When you become the person who no longer needs the outcome finds you effortlessly." Cecilia smiled faintly. That truth had lived itself through her. As she wrote her final reflections for the books afterward, she paused and looked out at the morning light spilling across her plants, her books, her hands. Each moment shimmered with presence. "The miracle," she wrote slowly, "was never that things changed. It was that I did." She underlined the sentence and whispered softly, "Thank you." A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Adrian stood there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. His smile was quiet, but warm. "Congratulations," he said. "The publisher sent me an early copy. It's beautiful, Cecilia. The world needed this." She laughed softly, a blush rising to her cheeks. "I think I needed it first," she replied. He stepped inside, setting the flowers on her table. "I wanted to thank you, not just for your work, but for reminding me that faith isn't a theory. It's movement." Cecilia met his eyes, and for a moment, time slowed. There was something unspoken between them, not romance in the cinematic sense, but recognition, like two souls who had walked through different deserts and found the same oasis. "It's all grace," she said gently. "We just learned to stop resisting it." They shared tea as sunlight flooded the room, illuminating the space in warm gold. Adrian noticed the candle beside her Bible. "You've kept it burning all these years?" he asked. She smiled. "I light it only when I feel led. It's a reminder of the night I stopped fighting life and started listening to it." He nodded thoughtfully, then said, "You've changed the way I see faith. It used to sound like waiting. Now it feels like alignment. Cecilia's gaze softened. Faith is when you finally stop asking for signs, she said, because your entire life has become one. After he left, she sat alone in the stillness again, letting the quiet sink deep. Outside, the day had grown brighter. Birds sang near her window, their melodies effortless, unself-conscious. She thought of a verse she had once clung to during her darkest hours. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. For years, she had read it as instruction. Now she understood it as revelation. Stillness wasn't absence. It was presence in its purest form. That evening, Cecilia walked to the park. The air carried the scent of rain and magnolia. Children laughed in the distance, and couples strolled beneath trees glowing with sunset light. She sat on the same bench she had once occupied years before, the one where she had first faced her reflection in the lake and felt lost. But today, the water no longer mirrored despair. It shimmered with peace. She whispered softly, "You kept every promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of rose and amber, Cecilia felt an overwhelming calm wash through her. It was as though heaven itself exhaled within her chest. She closed her eyes, and memories cascaded like gentle waves. The rain-soaked nights, the broken prayers, the first candle, the silence that had once frightened her. All of it had been sacred. Every detour, every loss, every delay, divine choreography. In that stillness, she heard a thought that felt not her own. You were never waiting for me. I was waiting for you to remember. Tears welled up, but they weren't sorrowful. They were the pure, wordless gratitude of a soul that had seen its own resurrection. She wiped them gently and whispered, "Now I understand." When she returned home, she lit her candle once more. The golden flame swayed, reflecting in her eyes like a quiet star. She sat down, opened her journal, and wrote her final words of the season. Miracles aren't loud. They whisper through the ordinary until you realize the ordinary was sacred all along. The moment you live with gratitude, you're already standing in the miracle. She closed the journal and placed her hand over it, her breath slow, her heart steady. Outside, the rain began again, soft, cleansing, eternal. Cecilia leaned back and smiled through the glow of candlelight. The woman who had once gone bankrupt had become abundant beyond measure, not in possessions, but in peace, purpose, and love. The silence that once felt cruel had been the language of a God who builds in whispers. And as the flame flickered one final time before settling into a steady glow, she whispered, "Thank you for everything, even the breaking, because it was through the breaking that I finally became whole."